Hello everyone, welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav, and in today's share Mitzvah Hashem, we will be learning Daf Kuf Nun Vav Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Megillah. We pick up today near the bottom of Kuf Nun Vav Amid Aleph, 2 lines from the bottom, near the end of the line, Siman Taf Reish Tzadik Sif Yud Zayin, in middle of the words of the Ramah, 2 lines off the bottom, Oid Kasvu. He brings down over here that the Achrayim write, Oid Kasvu, Shenagu Hatinoikos, there was a minig amongst the children, Lotzor Tzuras Haman, to make a picture of Haman, Al Eitzim Va'avonim, on pieces of wood or on stones. Or alternatively, Lichtov Shem Haman Alehen, or just simply to write the name Haman on pieces of wood or on stones, ulahakaisan zeh al zeh, and then to bang these stones or these pieces of wood together, kidei sheyimache shmai, so that either the picture or the name of Haman should become erased. Al derech machai timcha es zecher amalek, and in this way, this was taken from the concept of the pasuk ki machai timcha es zecher amalek, that we are supposed to erase and wipe out the remembrance of the nation of Amalek. So by banging these things together and wearing out either the picture of Haman, who was an Amaleki, or the name Haman, it's not a fulfillment of the pasuk of Machi Timche, but it's a remembrance sort of that concept. Or the Ramah says, the pasuk in Mishlei, that says, Vishem Rishon Yirkov, that the names of the evil ones should rot. And continues the Ramah here on the top of Kuf Nun Vav and Beis, Umizeh nishtabev haminig, and out of this minig grew the present custom that we have, Shemakim Haman, that we clap Haman, that we bang by every mention of Haman's name, Kishekarim HaMegillah Bebeis HaKnesses, when they lay the Megillah in Shul. And the Ramah says, Ve'ed levatel shum minig, we should never be mevatel a minig, or liloig olav, nor should we go ahead and chas v'chalila make fun of some kind of a minig. Kiloi lechinam hukpa'u, when we find that a minig is widespread in Klal Yisrael, you could be guaranteed that loi lechinam hukpa'u, that minig did not start on, it wasn't something that was done without a basis. There has to be some basis for something. If it became a kubal in Klal Yisrael, there's some kind of basis for it, and don't take it lightly. Says the Mishnah Berurah here on Kuf Nun Vav Amid Beis, Ois Kat Nun Tes, Shemakim Haman. This is how we got to the minig of clapping Haman. Maharil Lo Hayacheshish La'akos Haman. Chavetz Chaim brings down from the Maharil that he did not have this minig to clap Haman. Va'agayin Yavitz Kaisev al Aviv Chacham Tzvi. The Yavitz writes in the name of his father, the Chacham Tzvi, Shahaya Makeh, that he did clap Haman. V'roikeya beragloi, he would stomp with his foot. V'toifeach besandoloi, bang with his sandal. Kishegia l'schiras Haman, when they would mention Haman in the Megillah. V'apri Megadim kasav t'yotza scharam behefsedam. However, the Pri Megadim writes that this minig, actually, the benefit of the minig is outweighed by the potential loss of the minig, shamavalbal and harbe, because this creates a tremendous confusion in the shul during the Mikra Megillah. It disturbs a lot of people, and sometimes it ends up that people aren't yoytze Mikra Megillah because they end up not hearing the Shliach Tzibur. People get disturbed. It makes a whole ruckus. Sometimes it brings even chas v'chalila to strife. People start arguing with each other. So the Pri Megadim says it's yosas charai b'efseidai. At the same time, we see that this minig is already a very widespread minig in Klal Yisrael. Now, the Sharetzian brings down over here, Ois Kat Nun Zayin, and a lot of people might be wondering this. Why is the Pri Megadim so concerned about the potential downside of clapping Haman when people aren't going to hear? We know that what happens, the Balkari says Haman, everybody claps, and then the Balkari repeats Haman. So what's the problem? Sharetzian points out that that's not so pashut. Even though the Balkare will be quiet while the Olam is clapping Haman, and then perhaps he'll even repeat the word Haman, that's also not so proper, says the Chavetz Chaim. We said earlier that really lechatchila, you're not supposed to be mafsik in the reading of the Megillah more than Kidei Nishima. We said that between each pasuk, the Balkare is supposed to take a pause, the length of time it takes to take a breath. But lechatchila, we're not supposed to pause longer than that. Why not? Because the Megillah is called in Igeres, and it's supposed to be read in the same way that you read a letter. When you read a letter, you don't make pauses in the middle of reading a letter. Says the Pri Megadim, I didn't bring down what the Magen Avram says in the name of the Lavush. Shahaya Omer v'shem Rishayim Yirkov beis Zechiras Haman. Magen Avram actually brings down a minhag where they used to actually say the words Shem Rishayim Yirkov, kind of like Yamach Shemai. Every time they would say Haman, they would say Yamach Shemai. Ta'afib Neba Dezel Choshev Hefsik. And the reason, Chavetz Chaim says, the reason I didn't bring down this Magen Avram is because even if you'll tell me that this does not constitute a hefsek in the Mikra Megillah, mishum duhmi in Yana Shel Yaim, because this is like in Yana de Yoma, ukedemuchak Seif Sif Yud Gimel, we said earlier that you could even darshan the Megillah. If the Balkara wants, the Balkara could lane, and then he could give a little drasha on what he laned, and then lane weiter, and that doesn't constitute a hefsek because it's in Yana de Yoma. So too over here, maybe you'll say that Yamach Shemai is in Yana de Yoma. I'll call upon him Yuchal Tzmarach Mizer Kilkel Gadol. He says could come out from this a tremendous kilkel. Shalo Yishma Oz Eze Tevais Ben Ashler Tzibur Al Yedei. You're going to have people saying Shem Risham Yirkov, then they're going to miss a couple of words from the Megillah. V'lo Yotza Oz B'kriyas Megillah Lachein Tov Shalo Elamar Klal. Therefore, the Chavetz Chaim says it would be much better. We shouldn't say it, and therefore he didn't even bring it down inside in the Mishnah Berurah. Eis Katan Samach. We had this minik to klap Haman keshekayrin hamegillah bebeis hakneses when they lay the Megillah in shul. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'tzarach hakazin lishtoik oz be'es shamakin, and the Balkara has to pause from his kriya while they're clapping Haman kedei sheyishbu kulam kriyasai, so that everybody should be able to properly hear the kriya. Umipnei shematzim ha'oid kilkulam al yedei ha'hakah. Mishnah Berurah says, since it's very common that a kilkel will come out from this minig of clapping Haman, that people will not hear properly. Urigilam ana arim lahakos kama pamim be'es shechayzer hakaza likrais. And even though the Balkare is quiet when the kids clap Haman, and then he goes ahead and he says Haman over again, he says many times what we find happens is the Balkare says Haman, the kids clap, then he says Haman again, and the kids clap again. Al-Kain, Toiv, V'Nachain, the Mishnah Berurah says it would be good and proper. Shekol Yachid Yikra Pasuk Oishnayim Mitoch HaChumash Ba'oid Shemakin Haman. The Mishnah Berurah says a good eitzah would be, while the kids are clapping Haman, even if you don't have a kosher or Megillah, even if you only have a Chumash, read the next pasuk. That way, even if you miss a word, at least you learned it from a Chumash, so at least you'll be yotzeh b'di'evet. Kiaz afshalo yishma me'achazin. In that case, even if you didn't hear properly from the chazan, yotza k'may shekasav sif gimel. Like we said earlier in sif gimel, that a minority of the Megillah, as long as you read it, even if you read it from a Chumash, b'di'evet yotzeh. Let's see, sif gimel. Yeah, because b'di'evet, it doesn't have to come, a minority of the Megillah doesn't have to come from a kosher Megillah. B'di'evet. Okay. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. V'chei kasav ha-Pri Megadim, so writes the Pri Megadim, she'nachayin ma'oid, it is very, very proper, she'kol echad yitfais chumash be'es akriya, that everyone should at least have a chumash, and be reading from a sefer during the Kriyas Megillah. V'chol teva shelo yishpa min hachazan, and whatever you did not hear from the Bal Koreh, Yikra min HaChumash, you should at least read from the Chumash. Okay, now we go to Sif Yud Ches, a little bit of a complicated Sif. Says the Mechaber, we know that there are two possible Zmanim, at least two possible Zmanim, for Mikra Megillah. We have most of the world, open cities, they lay Megillah on Yud Daled. A city that's Mukav Chayma Mimais Yeshua Ben Nun, they lay on Tesvav. So, a laning on Yud Daled or a laning on Tesvav, for the people who are Mukav Chayma, that constitutes a Kriya Bismanui. You could have a Kriya outside of Yud Daled and Tesvav. We had a few cases where it's possible to lay the Megillah even earlier. Let's say you have somebody who normally would lay on Yud Daled, and he's going and he's traveling, and he knows he's going to be traveling on Yud Daled, and he doesn't have a Megillah to bring with him. He tried to find a Megillah. He cannot find a Megillah to take with him on his travels. So then the Mechaber said, we have a Kula, he could lay on Yud Aleph, on Yud Beis, on Yud Gimel, and we said, what is that Kula based on? So we know the first Mishnah in Masechtas Megillah, Megillah Nikreis, B'Yud Aleph, B'Yud Gimel, B'Yud Daled, B'Tezvav, Like Pachas V'Lo Yoser. Why? So he explained that you can have a laning on Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, or Yud Gimel because the small villages had a leniency. They were allowed to be makdim to the Yom HaKnisa. They were allowed to advance their Mikra Megillah to the day that the village people would travel into the cities. Since they need to travel into the city to hear the Megillah, they didn't have Bali Kriya by them. The Chazal made a kula for them, and they said the Yom HaKnisa was Monday or Thursday, so if Purim fell out on Wednesday, you could be makdim the Kriya 2 days early. Instead of laying on Yud Daled, you could lay it on Yud Beis. You could be makdim to Monday, to the previous Yom HaKnisa. So since we see that there's a halachic precedent for a Kriya on Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, and Yud Gimel, so under pressing circumstances, you could lay on Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, or Yud Gimel, albeit without a bracha. Now, the reason why it's done without a bracha, I don't know if I mentioned it back when we said this in Tafresh Peches. The reason that Kriya has to be without a bracha is because the allowance for that Kriya is ultimately based on a Machlekes Rishonim. Why? Nowadays, we don't have this kula of a small village being makdim Yom HaKnisa. We paskin like, I think it's Rabbi Akiva. Yeah, we paskin like Rabbi Akiva on Daf Beis Amud Aleph and Megillah, that's kula is not negeya nowadays. Therefore, nowadays there is no halachic precedent for laning on Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, and Yud Gimel. So there are Rishonim that say that since nowadays that halachic precedent is no longer in force, we don't use it anymore, therefore you can't lay on Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, and Yud Gimel, even if you're going to be traveling on Yud Daled. Other Rishonim hold, since there was such a halachic precedent, that kula works even nowadays, and therefore those Rishonim say you could do it. Since it's a machlokes Rishonim, we do it, but we do it without a bracha. Okay, now, with that little bit of Akdama, says the Mechaber, Sif Yud Ches, Megillah b'Yud Daled u'b'Tesvav. If you lay in the Megillah in its proper time, either on Yud Daled for somebody who lives in an open city, or on Tesvav for somebody who lives in an Ir Mukav Chayma, Tzarich lachzar achar asara. Lechatchila, you should look for a minyan. Lechatchila, the Megillah should be laid in a minyan. Now, the Mechaber says that this is negeya on Yud Daled and Tesvav. How about if you're not laying on Yud Daled or Tesvav? Let's say you're one of those people who are laying earlier. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Samach Aleph, B'Yud Daled or B'Tesvav. Hainu, what does this mean? B'Yud Daled la'ayaros. This is if you're laying on the 14th for somebody who lives in an open city. V'Tesvav, or you're laying on the 15th, la mukafin, for somebody who lives in an Ir Mukav Chayma. Or Ritzarno Loimar. And what the Mechaber is trying to tell you, the Mechaber says that this need for a minyan applies on the 14th or the 15th. Ritzarno Loimar, what he wants to say is Af shehu bizmana. What he's telling you is, even though you're laning the Megillah bizman, even though you're laning the Megillah at the proper time, you're laning on your Dalid, which is the proper time. Or if you're in an Ir Mukav Chayma, you're laning on Tezvav, which is the proper time. Ve'ikar presume nisa belav hachi, and therefore, even if you lane the Megillah without a minion, there still is presume nisa. Sha'akol karvid ba'isayzman. If today is your Dalid, everybody's laning Megillah today. Everybody's hearing Megillah today. Right? So even if you hear the Megillah without a minion, there's no lack of presume nisa. And therefore, you would think that maybe there's no Inyan of a minion. Remember, Kriyas Megillah is not considered a Davar Shebekdusha, like Kaddish or Kedusha or Baruch Hu, that requires a minion. So the only reason you require a minion for Mikra Megillah is for Presume Nisa. Now, if you're laning the Megillah on your Daled or Tezvav, there is Presume Nisa. Everybody's laning the Megillah today. So the Zicha is Presume Nisa. Yet, the Mechaber is telling you a Chiddush. Megillah be your Daled or Tezvav, Sarach Lachzar Akar Asar. Even though it's your Daled or Tezvav. So there already is adequate Presume Nisa today. Still in all, Lechatchila, you need a minion. Apologies for the voice. So again, says the Mechaber, says the Mishnah Berurah Samach Aleph, or Ritzayna Loimar, the Chiddush that the Mechaber is telling you is, Af Shehu Bizmana, even though you're laning Megillah Bizman on your Daled Tesvav, Ve'ikar Presume Nisa Balav Hachi, so without you getting a minion, there already is adequate Presume Nisa, Sha'akol Karvin Ba'isayzman, Afilu Hachi, still in all, Tzarech Litrayach, you have to be Matriach, Ulekabitz Asara, and pull together 10 people, Sheyu Be'es HaKriya, Mishur Presume Nisa. That by the Kriya, when you lane, there should be Presume Nisa. V'chol Shekein, Imu Shaloi Bizmana. So when the Mechaber said that on your Daled or Tesvav you need a minion, he didn't mean on your Daled or Tesvav you need a minion. And if it's not your Daled or Tesvav, you don't need a minion. No, certainly, if you're not laning on your Daled Tesvav, then you definitely need a minion. Because without your minion, there's no Presume Nisa. The Mechaber is telling you a Chiddush. Even if you're laning on your Daled Tesvav, Lechatchila you need a minion. Why? To make Presume Nisa at the time of your Kriya. So, again, the Mishnah Berurah says, certainly, if you're laning Shaloi Bizman, why would you be laning Shaloi Bizman? Kigayin, for example, Hamefarish B'yam, somebody who's going to travel by sea, V'ayotze b'shayara, or he's going to travel in a caravan, Ve'ena Moitze Megillah, L'hoylech Imai, and he was unable to find a Megillah to bring with him, Demutter Lahaktiv V'lekroisa Kaidim, where we said there's a kula that he's allowed to lane early, Kinir Le'el B'sibit Tarfresh Pechesiv Zayin, or another potential case where you might lane early. Oy, de Misrami Yom Tesvav B'Shabbos. We had a case. What happens if Tesvav Adar, the 15th of Adar, falls out on Shabbos? The 14th cannot fall out on Shabbos. But what happens if the 15th falls out on Shabbos? Not allowed to lane Megillah on Shabbos because Shemi Yavirenu Dalad Amos Berusha Sarabim. So what does an Ir Mukav Chayma do? So the Misrami Yom Tesvav B'Shabbos, the Tzrichen HaMukafed Lahaktim, then the people who live in a city Mukav Chayma, they have to advance the Kriya, V'lekroisai Be'erev Shabbos. They lane on Erev Shabbos, K'di Isa Sham B'Sivav, like we learned in Sivav. So here you have two cases where you might advance the Kriya and lane Shaloi Bizmanim. Either somebody who's traveling who doesn't have a Megillah, or somebody who lives in a Mukaf Ir Chayma and Tesvav fell out on Shabbos. So you're going to be makdim the Kriya to Erev Shabbos. In those cases, bevadai tzarech lekabitz asar lekriyasai. Then you certainly need a minion for your Kriya, because otherwise there's no Presume Nisa. Ubazeh, and in this final case of if Tesvav falls out on Shabbos, Chomer yoiser, there's even a greater stringency. The ileka asara lo yavarchu amukafin aleh. In this latter case, now this is interesting. We said like this. We already said, I told you in the Hakdama, somebody who's traveling who doesn't have a Megillah, if he lanes early, he never lanes with a bracha if he's laning early. Why? Because that laning, whether or not you could be yaitza with that laning, is tali and machlokes rishonim. But in this last case, somebody who lives in an Ir Mukav Chayma and Tezvav fell out on Shabbos, so all of the Mukafin Arei Chayma, they lane on Erev Shabbos, which is really Shaloi Bizmanoi for them. They're supposed to lane on Shushan Purim. They're laning on regular Purim because they can't lane on Shabbos. If they have a minyan, then they lane with a bracha. But if they don't have a minyan, then they lane without a bracha. Why do they lane without a bracha? So the Chavetz Chaim says in Sharitzia in Ois Katan Samach Aleph, because that's also tali on a machlokes rishonim. What machlokes rishonim? Whether or not when you lane shaloi bizman, if a minyan is ma'akiv or not. There are rishonim that say that if you're laning shaloi bizman, you must have a minyan. So the Ir Mukav Chayma, if they're laning on your dalit because Tezvav is on Shabbos, if they have a minyan, they make a bracha. If they don't have a minyan, they don't make a bracha. Okay. Ois Katan Samach Beis. So the Mechaber said, Lechatchila, the Mechaber doesn't use the word Lechatchila, but the Mechaber says, Tzarech lachzar akar asar. You're laning Megillah, even though it's Pizman, on your dalit on Tesvav, Tzarech lachzar akar asar, you should try to find a minyan. Now, I just should read the Mechaber weiter because everybody's puzzling over this, I'm sure. The Mechaber finishes off the sentence. If you cannot pull together 10, you can lane it b'yechidus. Says the Mishnah Berurah Samach Beis, Lachzar achar asara lechatchila. You should try to have a minyan. Furthermore, says the Chavetz Chaim, ve'im ba'es hahu karin isa b'tzibur bebeis hakneses. Let's say you want to have a private Megillah laning in your house. You don't want to go to shul to hear the Megillah. Says the Chavetz Chaim, ve'im ba'es hahu karin isa b'tzibur bebeis hakneses. If there's a bigger tzibur laning the Megillah in shul, az afilu yesh lo mea anoshim bebeisah. Even if you have 100 people in your private minyan, mitzvah leilech l'sham, it's a mitzvah to go to shul, mishum baroi v'amahadras melech. Especially on Purim, it seems. There's a big inyan of baroi v'amahadras melech. So if you have 250 people hearing the Megillah in shul, you have 100 people in a private minyan in your house, go to shul. Now, we had this halacha, we mentioned this halacha earlier in the beginning of Hilchos Megillah, and we said that's talking about bebeisai. That's talking about when you want to make a private minyan in your house. But if you have a shul all year round, this is where you daven, and your shul only has 50 people, and then in town there's a big shul that has 200 people, you're not mechuyev to close your shul and go to the big shul. You're a shul, they're a shul. But you want to make a private Megillah laning in your house, you have 100 people, but the shul has 200, then you got to go to shul. Continues the Chavetz Chaim. V'chein, similarly, if somebody's house is next door to the shul, and he has his windows open, and the windows are open to the shul, so he could hear. And not only that, he's hearing the laning that's coming from the shul with his 200 people. Is he mechuyev to go to the shul? Says Mishnah, yes. He's got to go to the shul mishum b'roivam. Vayin b'bir halacha. Okay, I was going to go weiter, but as you could hear, my voice is failing me. So I'm going to stop over here with the words of the Ramah. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. Schos of Liman HaTorah should be making at God's Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua's for us, Parnas and Shidduchim to all those in need. And we should be zeichet to see the BS Tzedek B'meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.